Okay, so this should be recording. Actually, I'm going to make this a test. Slide. No, I'm not going to make this a test. I can see it's being recorded. Okay, so this is the second time I've recorded this. The first time I wasn't actually showing you guys the slides. So I think that's changed now because I see a fantastic and obvious red box around my entire screen, which I'm pretty sure means that you guys are seeing this. So what I want to go over today is post-World War I and intro into the Roaring 20s. This is a long time coming. We don't have much time, and some of you guys are probably rolling your eyes. Thanks a lot. But, you know, and I apologize for not getting this to you guys. We went over that, but I thought I'd get it to you now. One good thing is that with DBQs, most of the information is given to you in the documents. And so that's what's nice about DBQs is that you know, we don't need to go as quite in depth on this area, but I don't want you to be without some knowledge on this area. And so I'm going to go over this with you and give you some context and help you out, right? So you can do the context and outside evidence and what's the other one? Complexity point for this, and generally understand the documents better now that we have this review of basically 1920 to 1945. Not going to do everything today, but this is what we're going to go for. So I would take a pause here, and you can copy down this outline I've given. I'm a little more in depth than I usually am in the classroom. You can copy this down, and you can take notes from it, or you can just listen through. That's fine. But what I want your focus to be on is, right, we're looking at kind of the decline of the progressive movement, or really the end of the progressive era. The progressive era is considered to be 1890 to 1920. And we're talking end of World War I, 1919. And you'll see why they call that kind of the end of the progressive movement. A lot of the ideals of progressivism kind of ended here. They climaxed with the 18th and 19th Amendment, and then we elected a Republican who called for a return to normalcy. Right, we get the decline of the labor movement, kind of the Red Scare, which kind of puts a cap on some civil liberties. But there's opposition to this as well. It's not that the progressivism dies. In fact, we get growing assertions and confidence by African Americans. And then we also do get some civil liberty successes during the time. But generally speaking, the economic woes at the end of the war and the Russian Revolution really scare the American public into kind of rejecting labor movements and increasing feminist movements and whatnot, and kind of, you know, the overall economic productivity that happens as we move into the 20s is going to, I guess, in some ways help Americans forget about the progressive movement. So let's keep an eye on that, and let's go from there. All right, so if you want to start with, you know, what's the impact of World War I, which is kind of what this section is talking about. We've got economic woes. Now, under economic woes, one of the biggest things we want to talk about is the post-war recession. Just about every war we've talked about had a recession. The 7 Years' War for the British basically had a recession for the colonies. Not to mention Great Britain. The American Revolution had a recession. The War of 1812, there was a post-war recession there, as there is in World War I. Basically, the American government was spending a lot of money on supplies for the military, you know, war production, whatnot. And when that comes to an end in 19, and it comes to an end quite abruptly, I don't know if everybody realized how quickly it would come to an end. The American government stopped spending on war materials, and so these companies who are producing that have to cut back production. They're going to lay off workers, and they're not going to be paid as much, and so there's going to be this adjustment, right? A fall in not so much like purchasing power by individuals. So the government's stopping its spending, production declines, and it's followed by a recession. So what does that recession mean? Well, it means a lot of things. It means layoffs and unemployment, which we'll get to. But it means an end to the wage and price controls that were established by the Wilson administration. So during World War I, and a very progressive thing to do was take control of the economy, establish wage controls, price controls, and to prevent inflation. And so the government could essentially pay for the things it needed to. Now, it's an oversimplification. Wage and price controls have a lot of problems inherent. There are a lot of unintended consequences. We're not going to go into that. But suffice to say that when the war ends, the price controls are released and companies are going to start raising prices. Now, if most companies across the United States economy are going to raise prices, it's going to contribute to inflation, a rising price in goods. And so the average, kind of basket of goods that Americans are purchasing are more expensive year to year. We see a huge increase, right? We see an increase starting, in about 1916 and then really peaking in 1920. And that's causing prices to be more or to higher for your average individual. And they're not going to like that. Obviously, it's going to be more expensive. Not to mention, you've also got unemployment. People who worked in factories producing war materials. If the companies aren't producing those, they're getting laid off. So you get factories laying off workers, they're not making money, and the people who are still working, their wages aren't increasing, yet the prices for products they buy are. And so that's going to lead us into some labor unrest. I'm going to stop here on the unemployment section before I move on and give you a little more context to labor unrest. Obviously, we've got the context of the unemployment rates, but I want to talk about the labor movement during World War I. It had increased substantially, right, in terms of union membership during World War I. And that's partially, or in fact, substantially due to the fact that the Wilson administration, in coordination with employers, got together and said, all right, the Wilson administration said, we will give you government contracts for war materials, but you need to recognize union membership. Now, you can recognize union membership, but we will also make sure that these unions are not going to strike. The government doesn't want them to strike because this is wartime. We got to get supplies to the troops to win the war, and the employers are gonna like this because while they may be having to pay workers a little bit more and recognize their unions, the fact that they're getting such huge government contracts is going to really help them. And kind of compensate for the fact they have to recognize union members. So union membership grows in World War I, but towards the end of World War I, that kind of coordination between the federal government and employers and unions falls apart because unions or corporations are going to start firing employees that they can't pay because they don't have the big demand from the U.S. government for supplies. And then once, even though wage freezes for employees are, I believe, unfrozen after World War I, employers are not going to raise wages. And this is going to contribute to some significant unrest and lead to, one of the biggest periods of labor unrest in the United States history. You've got about it's a huge wave of strikes. So I prematurely went to this next slide, but basically you've got the economic downturn, people getting fired, people who still have jobs not getting raises, while inflation's going on, and so people are upset that they feel like they're trapped and not able to get the wages and live how they live and buy the things that they'd like. This leads to a huge number of strikes. An unprecedented wave of about, you get about 3,600 in 1919. And so one of the big ones I want to talk about is the Seattle General Strike of 1919. This is an image, this is a photocopy of a pamphlet that was distributed by strikers in 1919 in Seattle. and to give you a little bit of context here, or the historical situation for this document, the strike in Seattle started with shipyard workers. They were building ships for the United States military. There was a lot of work to be done right during World War I. But after that, during and after that, there were no wage increases, and that people were getting laid off, and they felt as if, right, they had no control over their own labor. And so taking kind of some of them took kind of inspiration from the 1917 Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks. Undoubtedly, they weren't entirely sure of what exactly was happening, but they felt that, hey, if Russia did it, we can too. And so undoubtedly, right, some of these strikers were influenced by the Russian Revolution, and passing around pamphlets saying, hey, if they can do it, we can do it too. But interestingly, and we'll talk about this is going to really alienate middle and upper class Americans who take a completely different view of the Russian Revolution. They see it as a violent overthrow of a government and something that they don't want in the United States. And so we'll come back to that later, but I just want you to know, like, this is part of the reason why we end up getting the Red Scare, and why the public in general in the United States turns against these labor movements. The strike in Seattle ends up not achieving what it sought. It did spread to a general strike throughout the city of Seattle and shut the city down for several days, 5 or so, I think. But I don't think they got exactly what they wanted. And it probably failed in a significant part because of the American public was not with them. You also had a Boston police strike, and this kind of picture indicates that it failed, because what we see here is Calvin Coolidge, governor of Massachusetts, inspecting the National Guard, who he is called in to put down the strike. The Boston police force essentially quit en masse, right? All of them, or at least they didn't quit, but they went on strike, and which led to a period of chaos and rioting in Boston. Calvin Coolidge, who right at the time was governor of Massachusetts, basically called in National Guard and said that, right, there is no right, this is a quote from him, there's no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. So it gives you a sense of what he feels here. So he's a Republican in a fairly democratic state, which indicates to you maybe how things are going to go for the progressive movement, right? The progressive movement, which had tended to support labor strikes and labor movements. But now Massachusetts electing a Republican governor who's going to call on the National Guard to stop that. The National Guard effectively helps create law and order. And ultimately, Boston officials are going to fire the entire police force and hire a new one. So that 1919 Boston police strike fails as well. You'll see another, well, let's take a look. In what was probably, right, responding to the Russia Did It pamphlet, in Massachusetts, there was a cartoon that came out, right, entitled Massachusetts Did It. You see the Republican Party illustrated by the elephant with Coolidge on top, stomping the snake of radicalism, right, which gives you the kind of the understanding a lot of Americans viewed these strikes as radical, right, a snake, dangerous to American ideals and institutions. Somewhat, I mean, they associated with the Bolshevik Revolution. There's some link there, but we see the different perspectives from these sides. And it's no wonder that Calvin Coolidge is going to get the nomination for vice president in 1920 for the 1920 election. Even though he's kind of a soft-spoken individual, he was very popular at this time, in part due to his handling of the Boston police strike. By the way, if you recognize Calvin Coolidge's name, he does become president in the latter part, toward the middle of the 1920s, and we'll talk about him again. One last thing, there was a regional a region-wide steel strike in 1919, but also it too breaks in part due to lack of public support. In a lot of ways, even though the public was, generally having, they're living in this downturn, economic downturn as well, I think there's an overall perception that these labor tactics are rooted in radicalism, that they're somehow connected to the Bolshevik Revolution and this communist plot to take over the world, which in some ways does exist, and we'll talk about it. But we'll wait for a little bit to get there. Next, I want to talk about racial unrest, specifically the 1919 Chicago riots. And to preface this, to give you a little context, I want to talk about what was happening with racial attitudes. We already know that, a lot of individuals, let's talk specifically about white individuals, right, in the North went off to fight in World War I. When they did, they left their jobs behind. A lot of African Americans moved up from the South to get out of debt peonage and the slavery and the racism of the South, and filled in those jobs because, a lot of white workers are gone, but production demand is so high. So corporations need those workers. So African Americans, in part, fill that void. Now, when these white soldiers come back, they may either find their jobs unavailable because African Americans are working there, or they have to compete with, but basically they have to compete with African Americans. So that's going to create some tension. But keep in mind too that African Americans were also being laid off, and African Americans also went to war, served their country and came back and also had a difficult time finding jobs. And I like this picture. It's from, after the riots in Chicago in 1919, which we'll talk about, and shows a white National Guardsman facing off right against a veteran, an African-American veteran of World War I. We can see he's wearing his uniform. And that's really important because what it suggests is that African Americans are, understandably upset that even though they served their country, they're upset at the way that a portion or most whites kind of didn't really consider their sacrifice and weren't really honoring them. And so what we'll see is that this is a change in some of the tactics of African Americans, right? The progressive movement seemed to have failed them. We don't really get a lot of improvement in the rights and the quality of life of African Americans during the progressive movement. And so African Americans are going to see that and say, well, maybe we're not advocating for ourselves in the right way. And so we'll talk about this. Let's go back and ask why are we rioting in Chicago in 1919? To try to make a long story short, I gave you some context already, but a more specific kind of trigger for this rioting happened when an African American teenager was swimming in one of the Great Lakes. I believe it was one of the Great Lakes. I'm not very good with the geography up there. Never lived up there, so apologize. Maybe Lake Michigan. And he accidentally swam towards a white beach. Now, he never set foot on the beach, but he came too close for basically the white people who were there, the beachgoers there. And so they apparently stoned him. They threw rocks at him. He fell unconscious and he drowned. As a result, African Americans in the community rioted against white businesses, and then the white community also got together and rioted against black businesses and black communities. And so you had this week-long, or maybe 10 days or so, riot in which the death toll, I think, approaches about 100, and countless number of businesses and homes were destroyed. That was in the summer of 1919 in Chicago. And we see that obviously right here, the National Guard is in and facing off and to kind of reestablish order. But we see this kind of separation, right? We see this confrontation between white and black. As to what this guy's doing, I'm not really sure. He's free, do what you can tell, or I don't know, tell what I'm not sure. In any case, right? So I think we learn a lot from this. Is that African Americans who had taken a lot from a man by the name of Booker T. Washington, and essentially just, who advocated for African Americans contributing to dominant white society, not protesting for the right to vote, but rather just trying to be productive economically to show whites that they could assimilate. Now, Booker T. Washington was not the only African American theorist at the time, right? He's not the only person, but Booker T. Washington did put forth that argument I think it was after the Civil War. And a lot of African Americans did keep their heads down, in part because they believed that they didn't have the political capital, and if they protested too much, they would be killed. But now you enter into this new movement where African Americans are seeing that even though they are economically successful, even though that they contributed and sacrificed their lives in World War I, they're not getting the respect from whites that they thought they were due. And so you get the rise of a new type of, a rise in a new type of African American kind of protester, or kind of civil rights movement. So one of whom, one leader is the Jamaican-born Marcus Garvey, who was really popular and kind of began a new, kind of more nationalist, black nationalist movement, basically a little more confrontational, saying that that African Americans shouldn't assimilate into quote unquote white society and shouldn't try to appease the white man, but instead should protest for their rights. Ultimately, Marcus Garvey, as a Jamaican, was deported, I think, in 1924. But he made an effect, especially in the northern urban cities with African Americans, and calling on them, not to kind of be more aggressive in their demands for rights. You also see an increase in the NAACP. If you haven't read about them, right? The NAACP, I believe, formed in the early 1900s. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. We get that organization with significant legislative or legal victories in courts, really calling upon African Americans to and fighting for African Americans' civil rights and civil liberties. So we get that movement there as well. So we get this change in how African Americans as a whole are kind of seeing themselves and kind of and how they want to advocate for their own rights. And we'll talk about this again, but we see the increasing kind of aggressiveness of African Americans on different fronts, but we also at the same time will see a resurgence in the KKK, not just to combat what they see as the new African American movement, but also as this long-standing problem with immigration. And we'll see how the 1920s kind of, there's a lot of anti-immigration sentiment, and the KKK will capitalize on that. We'll talk more about them later. I want to move to the Red Scare, right? And talk about basically, right, revisit the kind of rejection of labor strikes. To give you a little bit of context, yes, there's economic downturn, but Americans are not really comfortable with the strikes that are happening from the labor movement. One of the reasons that might be is because of the Bolshevik Revolution, which occurred in November of 1917. Right, that's a little more than a year past if we're in 1919, and with the execution of the Tsar and some of the things that people are hearing from what's going on in Russia and the new Soviet Union, a lot of Americans are scared, and they see this as like aggression from the Soviets. The Soviets, who also essentially came out with a a document explaining that they were looking to spread communism abroad. And so the American public is looking at that and saying, oh, they want to export communism here. We are not interested in that. We feel it's dangerous. So that is kind of in the background here. We got the Bolshevik Revolution. We also got, right, even though immigration had been curtailed by this time period, we even going back with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and the increasingly anti-immigration legislation that passes through even during the Progressive era, there are still immigrants coming in, and a lot of these, and there are some of them who were anarchists or who were socialist in ideology or communist sympathizers, right? And so some of them are indeed bringing that ideology, and a lot of middle class and upper class Americans are afraid of that, and that's going to help lead to what are called the Palmer raids. Basically, what happened in the Palmer raids in 1919, you basically have a series of mail bombings and attempted mail bombings that occur throughout the United States. One of those, and the bombings are generally attributed to radicals or anti-American kind of radicals, not necessarily communists. And I'm not sure we ever really came to find out who was behind the mail bombings, but the public understood it to be by anarchists, and also associated them with communists or immigrant communists. And so one of the bombs actually went off at this gentleman's house. He was the Attorney General of the time. So Attorney General Palmer basically takes these bombings pretty seriously and establishes what's called the General Intelligence Division, which eventually becomes the FBI. And he uses his newfound power to basically conduct a series of raids and kind of capitalize off of this anxiety of many Americans to try to find these these immigrant anarchists, right, who are trying to subvert American institutions. In one of the biggest raids, he detained over 6,000 individuals. Never really did find, even though he said there was evidence of a grand conspiracy, he never really did find much evidence for that. Of those 6,000 individuals, about 500 of them were illegal immigrants, and they were subsequently deported. And they essentially were, those 500 were used as kind of evidence of this plot. And now some of them did have, socialist or communist ideologies. But I don't know. It certainly wasn't what Palmer was expecting. And so, those raids signify essentially this kind of a failure of World War I era kind of government policies of preventing sedition and espionage, right? And this kind of clampdown on civil liberties. We see in this article, in this cartoon, Europe is shouting at Uncle Sam to wake up, but Uncle Sam, post World War I, is still kind of constricting people's civil liberties through Palmer raids and through anti-immigration sentiment, right? Keeping people kind of under lock and key. Now, one kind of good example of that, and we'll go over very briefly, of this kind of anti-immigration sentiment is the case of Sacco and Venzadi. These were two Italian immigrants. I think they had both come in at like 1908, and then they were both accused of murder and essentially murdering and robbing an individual, murdering two individuals and then robbing him. Now the case against them was notoriously weak. Since then, some evidence has come out that one of the individuals may have been, that there was some evidence, but the reason why we talk about this case is because it was so poorly executed, and their rights as individuals were denied. They didn't get a fair trial. And so regardless of whether or not they were guilty, most historians agree that they were not guaranteed, they did not get a fair trial. And yet they were convicted and then ultimately sentenced to death, I think with the mid-20s, so either 24 or 27, they were actually executed. And a lot of people believe that it was because they are Italian immigrants. They were, quote unquote anarchists. They did have, that kind of played into a factor in the public's view of them as being guilty. But there was quite the outcry in their denial of civil rights, and their civil liberties, right, and the fact that they didn't get a fair trial. Well, I want to wrap up here with kind of just a real quick discussion of the end of the progressive movement. In the election of 1920, you get Warren G. Harding, Republican, elected with his vice president Calvin Coolidge. They run on a back to normalcy ticket, right? Essentially saying that with all these protests and the World War I, which was a huge waste of money, or the government was spending too much. We need to curtail spending. We need to stop these riots. We get a rejection. It was seeming rejection, or the American public seemingly rejects the progressive movement. And we'll kind of see that develop in the next lecture. But I want to signal too that a lot of people consider the 18th and 19th Amendment to be kind of the peak, the culmination of the progressive movement. The 18th Amendment, which was passed and ratified in 1919, that of course led to the Volstead Act and the prohibition of alcohol, or the sale and distribution of alcohol. Now that was a long-standing progressive goal, right, to end liquor consumption, and they achieved it in the 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919. And another long-standing goal of the progressive movement was women's suffrage, which was passed in the 19th Amendment and ratified in 1920. And so with that, you might not think that the progressive movement, it seemed the progressive movement was at its height. But with all these other things going on, it's quite possible that people saw that there was no more need for reform, or some people thought that the reform movement had pretty much ended. These are people not really concerned about African Americans or Native Americans, or perhaps about civil liberties or immigrants. And they thought, well, we passed prohibition. We now women can vote. What left is there to do? I'm exaggerating, of course, but generally with the riots and people, I think, were tired of the labor movements, and they were scared of the growing communist influence, and so they're looking for someone, perhaps a Republican, to lead them back to normalcy. And so we see actually quite a bit of decline, right, in progressive movements, starting in 1919, and going on into the 20s. What we will see in the next lecture, though, is that the economic downturn in the early 1920s reverses fairly quickly, and you would think maybe that if some people, maybe they forgot about the progressive movement because they were hit hard in the economically. But as the economy roars back to life in the 1920s, the progressive movement doesn't really seem to gain any traction or grow with it. And so we'll kind of take a look at that later. But think about those things: what's happening with African Americans, what's happening with immigrants, and the perception by the American public of those two groups. And then, consider why do you think the progressive movement ended up kind of declining at this time. We'll pick up again later with basically the economic boom of the 1920s, and then move into the Depression after that. Thanks, guys. Hope you find this helpful. Write your comments. So that's a preview of what we'll get next time.